I've never been one for conspiracy theories, government cover-ups, or shadowy cabals secretly running the world. Now, don't take that to mean that I trust those in power without question. When it comes to any claim made by a government official in a suit, I am as skeptical as most well-informed Americans. I don't doubt the government can keep secrets. I just doubt their ability to keep big secrets. You know, the kind that would permanently destabilize society if the truth ever got out. At least, I used to have those doubts. But now, I'm not so sure. And I'm honestly afraid of the larger implications of that. It's left me in this strange state of mind for a while now. I find myself constantly worrying about the integrity of my own thoughts. I can no longer watch the news without breaking out into cold sweats, terrified that it might be a precursor to an attack, one directed at me and only me. And it's all because I uncovered a secret that should have stayed buried. A secret I had no business knowing, let alone sharing. But I just don't think I can go the rest of my life keeping this to myself. Even if it means breaking a promise, even if it means making myself a target, I have to get this out there. People have to know what's been hidden from us for all these years. But putting what I've learned into words, that's going to be complicated, and not just because the implications are so disturbing. If you've ever dabbled in conspiracy theories or shady government programs, then chances are you've heard of MK Ultra. You could Google it right now and learn the basics of this once highly classified government program. And the long and short of it is this. In the early days of the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to study mind control and other psychic phenomena. And this was no joke. It was a serious scientific effort. They tried everything you can think of. They used drugs like LSD. They used indoctrination techniques typical of cults. They even brought in people who claimed to be real-life psychics. It may sound absurd now, but if such mental feats were at all feasible, then MK Ultra wanted to determine any and all possible military applications. And you don't have to wear a tinfoil hat to understand how valuable that could be in any war, cold or otherwise. And therein lies the devious brilliance of our government. Because what I just described, that's all true. The CIA really was working on mind control experiments during the Cold War. And they're not lying when they say that it was a serious scientific effort. No more nefarious than any other government program. But the fact that we know about MK Ultra is actually a telltale sign of a much bigger lie. It's actually an age-old tactic in espionage. Sometimes the best way to lie is to tell the truth. It may sound counterintuitive, but the key is to only tell just enough truth to make sure the substance of the lie stays hidden. That way, all the other myths and urban legends around MK Ultra can blossom and spread, taking on a life of their own among those who may genuinely be concerned about what our government is keeping from us. And in the process, it only further insulates the real truth. And best of all, no elaborate cover-up is really necessary here. There's no need for some massive disinformation campaign. Whatever lies there may be in a program like MK Ultra, they're all neatly concealed by the very people most intent on exposing the truth. The former Soviet Union would call those people useful idiots. But I believe those people are a lot more useful than they realize. I know that may sound naive, but I like to think I have more faith in humanity than most. And a big reason for that faith is because of my grandfather, who just happens to be the same reason I know these deep, dark secrets in the first place. He was among a very select few who were in a position to know about projects like MK Ultra. And how that knowledge ended up with me, well, that's a story in and of itself. Now, it wasn't some dark family secret that my grandfather worked for the government. My mother, my grandfather, and most of my aunts and uncles knew he'd spent his life in the military. He'd actually dropped out of high school early in order to enlist, and after making it through basic training, he served in various roles overseas before going into officers training. Over time, he worked his way up, gaining rank, influence, and more sensitive duties, as he called them. We still don't know when exactly he joined the CIA. there is a sizable chunk of his career that's largely redacted. What he did during certain periods was on a need-to-know basis, and his family and loved ones did not need to know. That's not just CIA jargon. He explained that to his family on multiple occasions and in no uncertain terms. But he never did it in a way that felt threatening or ominous. My grandfather just wasn't that kind of guy. Despite the work he did, he was always so kind, caring, and understanding. I don't even remember him raising his voice to me or my mother. And whenever someone did bring up his work with the government, he'd just brush it off.
It's classified, son. Believe me, you're better off not knowing.
He often said that with a good sense of humor. And for the most part, we laughed with him. We all just grew to accept that my grandfather dealt with sensitive government matters, and he was bound by his duty and his oath to the country not to tell us. But that sense of humor wasn't always on display, because there was a sizable period of his career that was forgettable, at least in terms of his demeanor. I didn't know it until much later, but that particular period coincided with MK Ultra. And during that time, my grandfather was a lot less pleasant to be around. My mother often said he'd come home late, looking restless and disturbed. Before then, he rarely drank, but on multiple occasions during this time, he would stumble home reeking of alcohol. Now, he never got violent, but he did get very argumentative. So much so that my mother could hear him arguing with my grandmother in every room of the house. And even when the arguing went late into the night, they would still wake up the next morning and act like nothing happened. My grandmother would still make the same batch of bacon and eggs for breakfast. My grandfather would still read the paper while drinking his coffee, even doing the crossword puzzle with my mother. This became so common during that time that everyone just got used to it. My mother, my two aunts, and my uncle avoided talking about it for the most part. My uncle even started sleeping through all the late night arguments, even when my grandfather got extra loud and extra hostile. They were all content to just compartmentalize these moments, chalking them up to the sensitive nature of my grandfather's work. It wasn't until my mother was a teenager that these arguments just stopped. It happened so suddenly that everyone in the family was all too eager to shrug it off. I figured that they were just happy that nights in their old house were a lot quieter. My grandfather now came home sober, clean, and in a relatively decent mood. And he and my grandmother wouldn't argue about anything that didn't involve grocery lists. And before long, that strange dark period in his career just faded into memory. And I probably would not have even known about this time were it not for a strange memory my mother shared with me a while back. I still don't know if she shared it with the rest of her siblings, but it did end up being very relevant, given where it ultimately led me. She said on this one particularly stormy night, my grandfather came home later than usual. The only reason she was still up was because she'd been cramming for a test she hadn't studied for. But when he got home this time, my grandmother was out there in the pouring rain to meet him. Now that was very unusual. My grandmother was not one to stay up that late. But, according to my mother, she just happened to look out her bedroom window when she saw the car pull up. Despite the late hour and the nasty weather, the headlights weren't on, but she was still able to see my grandfather and grandmother talking about something. Near as she could tell, it wasn't an argument, but it was definitely something urgent. Even as the rain picked up, they opened the trunk of my grandfather's car and started carrying something into the garage. She never figured out what it was, and later that week, when she checked the garage, she found nothing out of the ordinary. So she opted to just forget about it. She'd even bring it up to my grandfather. It just became one of those strange memories that stood out for reasons that she couldn't understand. And after that fateful night, my grandfather's career with the CIA seemed to stabilize. They even improved shortly after. Beyond his demeanor being better, the family started taking more vacations. They got nicer clothes. My uncle even got a new car for his 18th birthday, a reward from my grandfather for earning a college scholarship. And according to every record, official and unofficial, MK Ultra had been buried in a sea of classified bureaucracy. Overall, these were good times for my family all around. Everyone certainly appreciated my grandfather's improved disposition, and the CIA appreciated him even more. He proved to be very good at what he did for the rest of his career. I think the way he handled MK Ultra sealed his reputation. When they needed to bury the secrets of whatever they did in that project, my grandfather found a way to get it done. And that sort of competence will take you very far in the CIA. Ultimately, my grandfather ended up serving for 38 years. And when he finally retired, nearly every colleague went out of their way to shake his hand. He even got a personal letter from the president to go along with a very generous pension. By the time I came along, my grandfather had put MK Ultra and his CIA career behind him. He was content to be a full-time grandparent at that point, helping my mother in any way he could while she built a career of her own. Me being the oldest of my 3 siblings, I spent more time with my grandfather than most. Even when his health began to fail him, I went out of my way to be around him. I just always found his perspective so refreshing. And I also think he came to trust me more than most of his grandchildren, because he did let it slip a few times that he'd worked for the CIA, and he had seen things that only a few people have ever seen.
Kid, the number of people who know what I know, they could fit in a city bus and still have room for interns and secretaries.
Sometimes he'd say that with a twinge of humor. Other times, I think he was a lot more serious than he let on. There were times when I was tempted to probe deeper, but I chose not to. And as my grandfather's health deteriorated, my mother discouraged me and my siblings from asking too many questions about that part of his life. I think she was worried about triggering bad memories for both him and my grandmother. And I was perfectly content to honor her request. But then, a little over 8 months ago, my grandmother came down with a serious infection. It was minor at first, but it got bad. Very bad. She ended up in the hospital for 3 days, but on the 4th day, she passed away. And my grandfather, he did not handle her death well. He was already in a frail state physically, having had a heart attack 3 years ago. Now, he had this mental trauma on top of it. I honestly don't think he ever planned to outlive my grandmother. It just ended up being so jarring that some of those secrets he'd been so dutifully keeping started to slip out. In the months after my grandmother's funeral, I helped out while he moved into an assisted living facility. Now, this was at his request and not my mother's. For reasons that I would not understand until much later, being in that house all alone for days on end, it affected him deeply. It cracked some of those barriers that he'd kept up for so many years. There were times when I'd visit him in his frail state, and he would just start mumbling things.
Their minds. We starved them, and they became hungry. So hungry.
My mother had heard these things too. Both she and his doctors attributed this to escalating dementia. And yeah, that was probably true to some extent. But remember, the truth is often the best way to conceal a lie. And by the time he'd settled into his new home, we thought the worst was behind us. I also didn't learn this until much later, but my grandfather began making arrangements around this time. Arrangements that nobody in my family agreed with. It all had to do with the old family home that he'd lived in with my grandmother for 58 years. For some reason, he wanted it demolished and completely razed to the ground. And that was surprising to a lot of people. You'd think he'd have some sentimental feelings towards that home. I know my mom and her siblings sure did. But these were his wishes, and he fought for this, even after suffering another heart attack. Ultimately, he went behind their backs to commission a full demolition of the house, complete with a legally binding contract that could not be broken. And by the time my grandfather was on his deathbed, it was too late. My mother and her siblings couldn't stop it. They were still vehemently opposed to it, and they argued with multiple lawyers to change it, even after my grandfather eventually passed away. But it was on his final day with us, a day when I was actually at his bedside, that he let slip one final secret.
Their minds. Still hungry. I hear them. In the garage, under the mow. Please, promise me, you'll keep them there.
He died less than an hour later. We all cried, we all hugged, but we were also relieved. Well, they were. But I had more than just grief on my mind. And the next few days were a blur for my family. The whole melodrama with their old family home, it took a backseat to planning my grandfather's funeral. Now that was something I'd preferred to stay out of. I still intended to mourn my grandfather in my own way. But whether he intended to or not, he put me in a difficult position. He made me promise something that I didn't fully understand. And since he'd always made such a big deal about keeping promises, I took it upon myself to see it through. If only I'd kept that promise. If only I'd done what he'd asked, then maybe the last secrets of MK Ultra would have died with him. But I ended up breaking that promise. Believe me, I am not proud of it. I'm pretty sure my grandfather is cursing me at this very second, wherever he is. Because when I went to the old family house one night, when I climbed over the fence that had been put up by construction crews, preparing the place for demolition, I looked inside the garage. I stood over the corner where he'd always kept that oversized lawnmower. It was dirty and dusty, but even in the dead of night, I could tell there was something off. The concrete in this area was different than the rest of the garage. You could see this distinct square-shaped slab, a clear sign that it had been cut out and replaced. Now, I had been a road worker over the summer. I knew the signs better than most. I also knew my grandfather's handiwork. He had buried something in that garage, and he wanted to keep it buried. I really should have honored his wishes, but damn it, I couldn't. I just had to steal a shovel from the construction shed and lift up the slab. And that's where I found it. An unmarked box containing files on MK Ultra. Files with a special classification label that I had never heard of. I probably broke a lot of very serious laws just by touching it. But the only reason I read into them was because I recognized my grandfather's handwriting. His signature was all over these documents. He apparently saved them from destruction, which, by the way, constituted a gross violation of his duty. And suddenly, all that distress he dealt with for so many years, it made a lot more sense. But what was actually in those files, or what they revealed about MK Ultra, I doubt I could ever deal with it as well as my grandfather did. The first stack of files are actually dated a month after the program was officially shut down. But unofficially, MK Ultra continued under a new department. While my grandfather didn't run it, he did oversee it. He actually had a front row seat to what ended up being MK Ultra's most promising research. All those elaborate mind control methods that they'd tried before, using hypnosis, LSD, self-professed telepaths, special radio signals, none of them worked. They were all based on a gross misunderstanding of how the human mind operated. And that's a direct quote from an unnamed doctor. But just before the project was set to be canceled, this new doctor came in. This man my grandfather only identified as Dr. M. He claimed that he had an entirely new approach. Won't pretend to understand the science, but it involved infecting people with a certain species of amoeba. Now, you've probably heard of it before, the so-called brain-eating amoeba. It usually infects people who go swimming in dirty ponds or lakes. It is rare, but it's also devastating, usually becoming fatal once it ravages the victim's brain. But Dr. M had spent years modifying it somehow. And after who knows how many variations, he created one that the project called MK19. On its own, it was harmless. This kind of amoeba also did get into your brain, but it didn't actively attack your brain cells. It just entered your body and went into some kind of stasis mode, a cellular hibernation as Dr. M called it. Then, when the conditions were right, it was triggered. Now, the mechanism for that, it actually took many forms. It could be a chemical a person ingests. It could be a gas that someone inhales. Dr. M even claimed it could be induced by some sort of high-frequency radio signal. My grandfather noted that it sounded absurd, at least at first. But a few months later, he wrote a very distressing report that covered the test results. And this is where those secrets turn into real, actual horrors. Because that file box also contained pictures too graphic even for the time. They depicted the experiments that Dr. M conducted, some with animals, others with live humans. Now, my grandfather did note that these humans were prisoners. A few were even captured Soviet spies. But whoever they were, whatever they did, there is no way they deserved what Dr. M did to them. It usually started simple. They'd put MK19 in their food. Later on, they would put it in their cells through an aerosol spray, something they'd often mix with air freshener. Then they'd wait for MK19 to incubate, and that usually only took a few days. During that time, the subject would be completely normal. Most didn't even know that they were test subjects in an experiment. Then finally, at a certain predetermined moment, the team would trigger MK19. And what happened after that? My grandfather genuinely struggled to put it into words. In the span of just a few minutes, the subjects would become distant. They were alert, they were docile, they didn't show discomfort of any kind. They would just sit or stand in place, barely moving a muscle. No sign of any higher brain functions whatsoever. At first, Dr. M thought they were now in this deep, suggestive state, and he believed that MK19 had rendered their minds more malleable, as he put it. From there, they could use this state to program or guide people into doing their bidding. It all seemed so promising. Even a couple of high-ranking generals seemed very intrigued by the possibilities. They're the ones who wanted more tests, but my grandfather cautioned them against that. And of course, they didn't listen. That certainly helped explain his distressed state during those late-night arguments with my grandmother. He made numerous notes about his concerns that the project was moving too fast, and that they needed to slow down or at least put in some safety precautions. Unfortunately, his concerns ended up being painfully valid, albeit in a way he never expected. With all that extra funding, Dr. M ended up having a dozen test subjects in his special MK Ultra facility. They had all been infected and activated, completely mind-wiped and ready for the CIA to mold. For a time, there was real excitement within the research team. But they soon learned that these people that they'd infected with MK19, they weren't blank slates, so to speak. It turns out, they were all just biding their time. Or it might be more accurate to say that MK19 was biding its time. That's what my grandfather concluded. Because at approximately 11:13 p.m., on that fateful stormy night my mother had mentioned in her memory, every test subject was activated. That's the word my grandfather used. But based on the pictures and the reports, that was just an official way of saying that they attacked. Instantly, all at once, every test subject turned into this seething, aggressive, bloodthirsty monster. But they weren't crazy or unhinged. They were oddly focused. My grandfather described them as a swarm of fire ants. And they all went into attack mode, as though their queen and their colony was under attack. And just like that, nobody in the facility was safe. Every test subject, they would scratch, claw, beat, and bite anyone in their path. And they did so with almost superhuman tenacity. One report describes this undersized woman needing 5 military personnel to restrain her. And even then, 3 MPs ended up with serious injuries. But the most disturbing part, according to my grandfather, wasn't the destruction they caused or the people they hurt. It was how they all acted in perfect synchronicity, like some sort of hive mind. That's not a term my grandfather used, but it does seem to accurately describe how they operated. And as for what they wanted, well, they obviously wanted to escape the facility. That was clear to everyone. But it's what they said in perfect harmony that really stood out. My grandfather ended up writing it out at least 50 times, as if to measure the extent of their deranged state.
So hungry. Your thoughts, your minds, so hungry.
As each test subject said these words, they would try to tear open the heads of anyone in front of them, living or dead. They would literally claw out eyes and rip off jaws, shoving their hand through bone, brain, and flesh, all to get to that precious brain matter in their skulls. And even if they got just a little on their hands, they would, well, it would have been better if they had just eaten it. My grandfather notes say they got a bit more creative with it. I'd rather not go into details, but whatever disturbing act you're thinking of, I promise, it was 10 times worse. In the end, my grandfather was the one who gave the order to lock the whole place down. But that was only after one of the generals on hand got his eyes gouged out. And what unfolded after that is unclear. The documents get heavily redacted from that point forward. Near as I can tell, nearly everything and everyone in the test area was disposed of. But I know that's just CIA jargon for saying that everyone trapped inside was killed, including the test subjects. Every dead body, every bloodied floor tile, every scrap of paper and supply that existed within those walls. It was all destroyed and sent to an incinerator. I know this because my grandfather often joked about incinerators, saying they were the CIA's preferred method of keeping secrets. I now know he was not joking. Officially, every name of every person involved in Dr. M's experiments, including Dr. M himself, died of unrelated causes. Now, that's typical of any spy agency. When things go bad, they make the aftermath as mundane and unrelated as possible. I don't know how much or how little my grandfather was involved in that, but I do know this. The files he kept in his garage were supposed to be destroyed. My grandfather even signed off on the order, but he just chose not to carry it out. It was probably the only time in his career that he defied a direct order. I can't imagine how much distress that caused him. But in reading one last letter that he'd kept in a sealed envelope, one he wrote himself on that fateful night, I now understand why. It's the only item I kept from that box of files before I burned them all. And trust me, if anyone else saw what was in that box, you'd have done the same thing. But I only kept this letter because, well, it's not just a memento of my grandfather's legacy. It's also the last bit of documentation for the last secrets of MKUltra. I still don't know if I'll end up burning it too. I don't think it ultimately matters. But before I make that choice, I wanted to read the last couple paragraphs. Because even if these secrets remain buried, the legacy of MKUltra might not be over.
I don't have much time left. The agency is preparing a massive purge of Dr. M's work. MKUltra was bad enough when it was just wasting money on pseudoscientific crap. But this is far worse. I keep telling the director that they can't stop at destroying the lab. They can't just assume that Dr. M kept MK19 completely contained. He said he had taken all the necessary precautions, even before everything went horribly wrong. But I don't believe him for a second. I think he let that monstrosity out. I've played poker with the man. He always hedges his bets. And if he unleashed that thing into the water supply or the air, then it's already too late. MK19 is out there, and for all I know, it's already dormant in countless people. It may even be inside me and my family. But now that Dr. M is dead, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the secrets of what triggers MK19 died with him. But if they didn't, if someone else is able to learn these secrets we're trying so hard to bury, then I genuinely fear for the millions of minds at risk. MKUltra was an atrocity on its own, trying to control the minds of other people. But what it ultimately did, and what it might ultimately do, it may very well unleash something that we can never control.